This whole mess started 3 years ago when I finally broke up with my ex, Jake. We had been together for about 2.5 years, and looking back, I should have noticed the red flags earlier. Jake was one of those guys who always talked about big dreams but never actually worked towards them. When we first met, I thought his ambition was attractive. He talked about starting a business, getting into real estate, maybe doing some freelance marketing, but as months turned into years, I realized he was all talk and no action. For the last year and a half of our relationship, he lived almost entirely off me. I was working full time as a medical assistant at a family practice clinic, making decent money for someone in their mid 20s. Jake, meanwhile, bounced between part-time gigs that lasted only a few months each. He would get fired from retail jobs for showing up late, quit restaurant work because the managers were supposedly jerks, and never saved any money. Meanwhile, I was paying rent, covering groceries and utilities, and even paying his car insurance when he came up short. I was carrying the entire household. The breaking point came when I found out he had been using my credit card without telling me. He ordered DoorDash and bought random Amazon items, running up hundreds of dollars. When I confronted him, he got defensive and accused me of being controlling about money. He claimed couples should share everything and promised to pay me back once his next big opportunity came through. Of course, that opportunity never materialized, just like all the others. I gave him a month to move out and find somewhere else to live. The breakup was ugly. Jake accused me of never believing in him, said I was materialistic and only cared about money, and warned I would regret leaving when he became successful. It was classic manipulation, and I am embarrassed that I put up with it as long as I did. Eventually, he moved back in with his parents, and I blocked him on everything, changed my Netflix password, and got on with my life. The 3 years after were honestly the best years I had in a long time. I was promoted to senior medical assistant, started dating again, picked up hobbies I had neglected, and made new friends. I rarely thought about Jake except when mutual friends mentioned him or when his mom awkwardly waved at me in the grocery store. Then last month, out of nowhere, I got a text from an unknown number. It was Jake. Somehow he had gotten my new phone number, probably through a mutual friend. The message was long and seemed heartfelt. He apologized for how things ended, said he had been doing therapy and reflecting, and admitted he had been unfair to me. He mentioned that he had been working steadily for over a year, had his own place, and was in a better headspace. He said his therapist encouraged him to make amends with people he had hurt, and I was skeptical, but also curious. Friends had mentioned seeing him at the gym, and another said he was working at a marketing company downtown. He seemed to have gotten his life together. His text felt genuine, and I was in a good enough place that the idea of closure did not scare me. Jake asked if we could meet for coffee or lunch so he could apologize in person. He emphasized that he was not trying to rekindle anything, just wanted to clear the air. And after a few days of thought, I agreed. I figured the worst that could happen was an awkward hour of conversation, and maybe it would feel good to get a genuine apology. We decided to meet at a restaurant. It's one of those trendy farm to table places popular with young professionals. Jake suggested it, saying he liked the atmosphere. We set the meeting for a Saturday afternoon around 2 p.m. when it would not be too crowded. I probably spent more time than necessary deciding what to wear, not to impress Jake, but to look confident and put together. I chose dark jeans, nice blouse, and a blazer. I also told my roommate and best friend exactly where I was going and when I expected to be back, just in case. When I walked into the restaurant, I noticed it was busier than usual for that time of day. There was professional camera equipment set up in one corner. I figured maybe the restaurant was filming a commercial. It did not cross my mind that it had anything to do with Jake. Then I saw him. He was sitting at a table near the camera setup, looking more polished than I remembered, but he was not alone. Three other people sat with him, including someone with a camera pointed directly at the table and another holding audio gear. The realization hit hard. This was not a private closure conversation. This was some kind of recording, and I was about to be part of it without my consent. I should have turned around and left. That would have been the smart move. But I was so shocked and angry that I froze. Jake spotted me and waved with a big smile as if nothing was wrong. As I walked over, I heard him talking to the camera about how his ex-girlfriend was about to join them for an important conversation about toxic relationships and personal growth. The audacity was unreal. He stood up, tried to hug me, and kept talking about how brave I was for agreeing to be part of his journey of self-improvement. He introduced me to his crew as his ex, who had taught him valuable lessons. It felt staged, rehearsed, fake. Then I noticed a microphone on the table. Before he could launch into his speech, I grabbed it. The look of panic on his face was priceless. I started speaking directly into the mic, thanking Jake for giving me the chance to finally publicly talk about what a terrible partner he had been. I told the crew how he had financially abused me, used my credit cards, manipulated me emotionally, and freeloaded off me while contributing nothing. I described covering rent, utilities, groceries, his car insurance, and even his entertainment while he quit job after job. I explained how he gaslit me into thinking I was unreasonable for expecting him to contribute, and how he made me feel guilty for wanting a responsible partner. I mentioned the Amazon orders and food deliveries on my credit card that I only discovered on the bill, and how he justified it by saying couples should share everything. Jake kept trying to interrupt, panicked at losing control of his little production. But I kept going. I talked about how much better life became after I left him, how I was promoted at work, how my mental health improved, and how I finally had time to enjoy friends and hobbies without his constant drama. I also pointed out how dishonest his meeting was. He had told me it would be a private apology and closure conversation, but in reality, he had ambushed me with cameras for content. I called out the irony of someone trying to make a show about toxic behavior while engaging in manipulative and deceptive tactics himself. The camera crew looked uncomfortable, like they were realizing this was not the project they thought it would be. Jake kept trying to steer things back to his talking points about accountability, but I would not let him. I wrapped up by saying I was glad he had arranged this because it gave me the opportunity to publicly process how toxic our relationship was and how much better I was without him. I thanked the crew and suggested that maybe Jake's next episode should be about informed consent and respecting boundaries. Then I put the mic down, grabbed my purse, and walked out without looking back. I could hear Jake calling after me, probably trying to salvage something, but I kept walking. The whole thing lasted maybe 15 or 20 minutes, though it felt much longer. My heart was racing the entire drive home, partly from adrenaline and partly from rage. I could not believe Jake had tried to pull such a manipulative stunt? Now, 3 days later, I'm still processing it. And part of me feels proud that I flipped the situation and told my side of the story instead of letting him control the narrative. Another part wonders if I should have simply left and denied him the footage. Holy crap, you guys. I was not expecting the response I got on my original post. Thank you to everyone who commented and messaged me with support. Reading your responses really helped me feel better about how I handled the whole situation. A few people asked for an update, and honestly, I wasn't sure there would be one. I figured Jake would either quietly shelve the footage or try to edit it into something that didn't make him look completely terrible. I was wrong. So it turns out Jake actually does have a podcast. It's called Growth Mindset Chronicles. And apparently, he's been doing it for about 8 months. From what I could tell by scrolling through his episodes, it's one of those self help personal development shows where he interviews people about overcoming challenges and becoming better versions of themselves. The production quality is actually pretty decent, which explains the professional camera crew. I found this out because yesterday my friend Sarah texted me a link to his latest episode with a bunch of shocked face emojis. The episode was titled When Closure Goes Wrong, A Lesson in Accountability, and was posted just 2 days after our restaurant encounter. I debated whether or not to listen to it, but curiosity got the best of me. I'm honestly glad I did, because it was not at all what I expected. Jake actually used the footage pretty much as it happened. He didn't try to edit out my comments or make me look bad. The episode starts with him explaining to his audience that he's reached out to an ex-girlfriend for closure as part of his personal growth journey, and that he'd planned to have a conversation about taking accountability for past mistakes. But then he admits that he made a huge error in judgment by bringing cameras to what was supposed to be a private conversation without getting my explicit consent first. He acknowledges that this was manipulative and deceptive and that my reaction was completely justified. The really surprising part was that he played almost my entire speech unedited. All the stuff I said about him, freeloading, using my credit cards, and being emotionally manipulative, it's all there. He didn't try to defend himself or minimize any of it. After playing the footage, Jake spent about 20 minutes talking about how the whole experience had been a wake-up call for him. He said that hearing me describe our relationship from my perspective, especially in front of other people, made him realize that he'd been lying to himself about how much he'd actually changed and grown. He talked about how he'd been telling himself that our breakup was mutual and that we'd both made mistakes, but that my comments made him confront the fact that he'd been the toxic one in the relationship. He admitted that even reaching out to me in the first place had been selfish, and that planning to record our conversation without my knowledge was just another example of him prioritizing his own needs over other people's consent and comfort. The episode ended with Jake apologizing directly to me and to his audience for his poor judgment. He said he was taking a break from the podcast to focus on actual therapy and personal work, not just the performative kind he'd been doing for content. I have such mixed feelings about all this. On one hand, I'm glad he didn't try to make me look bad or twist my words. It takes some level of maturity to admit you were wrong so publicly, especially when you could have just buried the footage and pretended it never happened. But on the other hand, I'm still not okay with being recorded without my consent, even if he ended up using the footage responsibly. And I can't help but wonder if this is all just another performance for him, like maybe admitting his mistakes so publicly is just another way of making everything about him and his journey. The weirdest part is that the episode actually got a lot of positive comments. People were praising Jake for his honesty and accountability, saying it took courage to share something so unflattering about himself. A few people even commented that they'd been in similar situations and appreciated hearing both sides of the story. I'm not sure how I feel about random strangers on the internet having opinions about my relationship and breakup, but I guess that's the reality when you date someone who apparently thinks their personal life is content. My roommate thinks I should reach out to Jake and demand that he takes the episode down, but honestly, I'm not sure I want to open that door again. The episode doesn't paint me in a negative light, and if anything, it validates everything I said about our relationship. Maybe it's better to just let it exist and move on completely. What do you guys think? Should I be more upset about this than I am? Is it weird that part of me is almost impressed that he didn't try to make me look bad? Update 2. You guys, this situation has taken such a bizarre turn. I honestly don't know whether to laugh or be concerned at this point. So, after my last update, I decided to just ignore the whole podcast thing and move on with my life. I figured Jake had gotten his content, learned his lesson, and we could both just pretend that the other didn't exist like we had for the past 3 years. But apparently, the universe had other plans. Yesterday morning, I was at work doing my usual routine when my supervisor, Linda, asked me to come into her office. She had this weird expression on her face that I couldn't read, somewhere between confused and amused. My first thought was that I'd made some kind of mistake with a patient file or missed an important deadline. Instead, Linda told me that she'd received a very strange phone call that morning from someone claiming to be a podcast producer who wanted to offer me a job. Apparently, someone named Marcus had heard Jake's podcast episode and thought I had a natural talent for calling out toxic behavior and speaking authentically about difficult topics. I was mortified. The idea that my personal drama was now bleeding into my professional life was exactly what I'd been worried about. I immediately started apologizing to Linda and explaining that I had no idea anyone would contact my workplace, that it was a personal situation that got out of hand, and that I'd make sure nothing like this happened again. But Linda surprised me. She said she'd actually listened to the podcast episode out of curiosity after Marcus explained the situation, and that while she obviously couldn't endorse employees' personal lives becoming public content, she was impressed with how I'd handled myself. She said I came across as articulate, honest, and assertive in a way that a lot of people struggle with. The conversation with Linda was awkward, but ultimately fine. She made it clear that she didn't want my workplace getting any more calls from podcast people. But she wasn't mad at me or anything. If anything, she seemed kind of proud that someone from her team was getting recognized for speaking up for themselves. But the really crazy part came later that afternoon. I was having lunch at my desk when I got a call from a number that had contacted my workplace. Against my better judgment, I answered it. The guy on the phone was Marcus, and he explained that he produced a podcast called Unfiltered Truth that focuses on people sharing their real, unvarnished experiences with toxic relationships, workplace drama, family conflicts, and other difficult situations that people usually keep private. He said that Jake's episode had gone somewhat viral in certain online communities, particularly among women who'd had similar experiences with toxic partners. Marcus told me that my segment of Jake's podcast had been clipped and shared on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, and that thousands of people were commenting about how refreshing it was to hear someone refuse to be steamrolled by their ex's attempt at image rehabilitation. Apparently, there's a whole online discussion happening about performative accountability and how people use therapy speak to avoid real consequences for their behavior. I honestly had no idea any of this was happening. I don't spend much time on social media, and I certainly hadn't been monitoring Jake's podcast or looking for clips of myself online. The thought that strangers were watching and discussing my personal business was both flattering and terrifying. Marcus offered me what he called a consulting opportunity. He wanted me to co host a few episodes of his podcast, specifically focused on helping people identify and respond to manipulative behavior in relationships. He said my ability to stay calm while firmly setting boundaries was exactly what his audience was looking for. The offer was actually pretty tempting from a financial standpoint. Marcus was talking about real money, like more per episode than I make in a week at my current job. He said his podcast had a significant following and that episodes featuring relationship drama and toxic behavior got the most downloads and engagement. But I told him I needed time to think about it. The whole thing feels surreal. 6 months ago, I was just living my quiet life, working my medical assistant job and minding my own business. Now, apparently, I'm some kind of internet personality for calling out my freeloading ex-boyfriend. I spent last night going down the rabbit hole of looking up clips and comments about Jake's podcast episode. It's so weird seeing strangers analyze your life and relationship. Most of the comments are supportive of me and critical of Jake, with a lot of people sharing their own stories about toxic exes who tried similar manipulation tactics. But there are also some comments that make me uncomfortable. Some people are treating the whole thing like entertainment rather than a real situation involving real people. Others are speculating about details of my relationship with Jake that weren't even discussed in the podcast. A few people have even tried to figure out who I am and where I work, which is terrifying. I'm honestly torn about Marcus's offer. Part of me thinks it could be empowering to help other people recognize and deal with toxic behavior. The money would definitely improve my life significantly, and maybe I could use this weird platform for something positive. But another part of me just wants my privacy back. I never asked to become a public figure, and I'm not sure I want my personal experiences to become content for other people's entertainment. My best friend thinks I should take the podcast opportunity and run with it. She said I've always been good at giving relationship advice, and this could be a way to turn a crappy situation into something beneficial. My roommate is more cautious, worried about what happens if this internet fame thing goes badly or if people start trying to dig into my personal life. I have until Friday to give Marcus an answer. I honestly have no idea what I'm going to do. This whole situation has spiraled so far beyond what I ever could have imagined when I walked into that restaurant 2 weeks ago. Update 3. I can't believe I'm writing another update, but this story just keeps getting weirder, and I promised I'd let you guys know what I decided about the podcast offer. First, the decision about Marcus's podcast. After reading all your comments and talking it over with friends and family, I decided to turn down the co hosting opportunity. While the money was tempting and I appreciated that Marcus seemed to have good intentions, I ultimately decided I'm not comfortable building a career on other people's relationship drama, even if my own experience was what got me noticed. I called Marcus on Thursday and politely declined. He was surprisingly understanding about it and said the offer would remain open if I changed my mind in future. He also mentioned that Jake's episode was still getting shared widely and that he'd received dozens of messages from people wanting to share their own toxic relationship stories. That conversation got me thinking about Jake and how he was handling all this attention. His podcast episode had way more downloads and engagement than his usual content. And I was curious whether he was planning to capitalize on the viral moment or actually follow through on his promise to take a break and focus on therapy. I got my answer on Friday night in the most unexpected way possible. I was home watching Netflix when my doorbell rang around 9 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I generally don't answer the door that late unless I know someone's coming over. But whoever it was kept ringing the bell persistently, so I finally looked through the peephole. It was Jake. He was standing on my front porch holding what looked like a large gift basket, and he appeared to have been crying. I honestly considered just pretending I wasn't home, but something about the way he looked made me worried that he might do something dramatic if I didn't at least acknowledge him. So I opened the door, but I left the chain lock engaged so it would only open a few inches. Jake immediately started apologizing profusely. He said he knew he shouldn't have come to my house without permission, but that he'd been trying to work up the courage to reach out for days and finally decided he needed to apologize in person. He explained that the podcast episode had gotten way more attention than he'd expected, and that reading the comments and reactions had made him realize how much worse his behavior was than he'd understood. The gift basket was apparently filled with expensive skincare products, gourmet coffee, and chocolate. Basically, the kind of generic luxury items you'd give someone when you have no idea what they actually like, but want to spend enough money to seem sincere. Jake said he wanted to compensate me for the time and emotional labor I'd spent dealing with his mess, both during our relationship and during the restaurant ambush. But then he said something that really caught me off guard. He told me that several brands and sponsors had reached out to him after the podcast episode went viral, wanting to partner with him for content about accountability, personal growth, and relationship advice. Apparently, his honest admission of being a toxic partner had somehow made him more attractive to companies that market to young adults working on self improvement. Jake said he turned down all the sponsorship offers and was planning to delete the viral episode from his podcast feed. He told me he'd realized that profiting from content about our toxic relationship, even if he was being honest about his own faults, would just be another way of using me for his benefit without my consent. I was honestly shocked. The Jake I dated would never have turned down an opportunity to make money or gain attention, especially if he could justify it as being educational or helpful to others. Either he genuinely changed significantly or he was playing some kind of long game that I couldn't figure out. We talked through the door for about 20 minutes. Jake told me he'd actually started real therapy, not just the life coaching stuff he'd been doing before, and that his therapist had helped him understand that his pattern of making everything about his journey and growth was itself a form of self centeredness. He said he was working on learning the difference between genuine accountability and performative self awareness. The conversation was weird, but not unpleasant. Jake seemed more genuinely remorseful and self aware than I'd ever seen him, and he wasn't trying to argue with me or defend his actions at all. He acknowledged that ambushing me with cameras was manipulative and wrong, that using my credit cards during our relationship was financial abuse, and that reaching out for closure had been selfish even if his intentions weren't entirely bad. When he was getting ready to leave, Jake asked if there was anything else he could do to make amends for how he treated me. I told him the best thing he could do was actually follow through on his promise to work on himself in private, without turning his personal growth into content for other people to consume. He agreed and then said something that I'm still thinking about. He told me that watching the clips of our restaurant conversations circulating online made him realize how much other people's validation still mattered to him, even when he was supposedly focused on accountability and growth. He said seeing strangers praise him for admitting his mistakes had felt good in a way that made him question whether he was actually sorry or just sorry that he looked bad. Jake left the gift basket on my porch and walked away without asking for anything else from me. I brought it inside and ended up sharing most of the contents with my roommate since I felt weird about keeping expensive gifts from my toxic ex, even if they were supposed to be an apology. The really surprising part came on Saturday morning. Jake posted a final episode of his podcast announcing that he was ending Growth Mindset Chronicles permanently. He explained to his audience that he'd realized his approach to personal development had become performative and self-serving, and he needed to step back from public self-reflection to do actual private work on himself. In the episode, he also announced that he was donating the money he'd made from increased downloads and new subscribers to a domestic violence charity, since many of the comments on his viral episode had pointed out that financial abuse is a form of domestic violence that often gets overlooked. I have to admit, I was impressed. It's easy to talk about accountability and growth, but actually giving up money and attention when you're getting positive feedback takes real commitment to change. So that's where things stand now. Jake has apparently deleted his podcast and disappeared from social media. The viral clips are still circulating, but without new content to feed the algorithm, I think the internet's attention will move on to the next drama pretty quickly. I'm back to my normal life with the weird addition of occasionally getting recognized by strangers who've seen the clips. It's mostly been positive. A few people have thanked me for speaking up about toxic relationship patterns, and one woman told me that seeing my response to Jake's ambush gave her the courage to set boundaries with her own manipulative ex. Marcus still texts me occasionally to see if I've reconsidered the podcast opportunity, but I'm sticking with my decision to keep my personal life private. I've learned that viral internet fame, even for doing something right, comes with complications I'm not interested in dealing with. Looking back on this whole weird experience, I think I'm glad it happened the way it did. Not because I enjoyed being ambushed or having my business broadcast to strangers, but because it forced Jake to confront his behavior in a way that private conversations never did. Sometimes people need to see themselves through the other people's eyes to understand the impact of their actions. And honestly, it was pretty satisfying to grab that microphone and tell my side of the story after years of being painted as the unreasonable ex who didn't believe in Jake's potential. Even if I never intended for thousands of people to hear it, I'm glad I stood up for myself in that moment. I don't know if Jake will actually follow through on his promises to change, but that's not my responsibility anymore. I did my part by being honest about our relationship, and now it's up to him to decide what kind of person he wants to be. Thanks again to everyone who followed this bizarre story and gave me advice along the way. I definitely didn't expect my complaint about a bad ex to turn into whatever this was, but your support and perspectives really helped me navigate it all. Here's hoping my life goes back to being boring and drama free now. I've had enough internet fame for one lifetime. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.